So the Mongol era in world history covered much of the 13th and 14th centuries and had a decisive results for most of the societies in Europe and in Asia. Now, the traditional view of the Mongols as bloodthirsty barbarians has been almost completely reassessed. More recently, the Mongols have been seen as an unusually tolerant people who established a political system that facilitated interregional contact to a greater extent than had ever been possible in world history. Now, in 1999, The Economist, a respectable British periodical, named Genghis Khan the man of the millennium. This was largely a tribute to Genghis as the first in a succession of Mongol rulers who would administer their conquest reasonably wisely and would use conquest deliberately to accelerate contact among different peoples. Now, it's true that the Mongols could be cruel, killing urban civilians to ensure that others would yield more quickly to their forces. Nonetheless, the dominant revisionist picture seems valid. Now, the Mongol invasion of China was the last in a series of eruptions from the nomadic territories of Central Asia that had earlier seen such groups as the Indo-Europeans and Huns pour out. Probably some combination of population pressure and a fairly fragile nomadic economy, political rivalries, and divisions in China itself prompted the Mongols to eye the rich society to their east. The Mongols had long been one of the several border peoples harassing the Chinese and pressing into Chinese territory during the Song dynasty. Early in the 13th century, Genghis Khan conquered a good bit of China. The conquest was completed in ensuing decades, so that Genghis's grandson, Kublai Khan, became ruler of China. Now, this Mongol rule, known as the Yuan dynasty, would last for most of the next century. Now, once in power, the Mongols made use of the Chinese government system and bureaucracy, along with Confucian values. Now, although they disapproved of many aspects of Chinese culture, they were generally tolerant. Mongol rule in China brought clear economic benefits, expanding both manufacturing and trade opportunities. In addition to Chinese bureaucrats, the Mongols used a variety of foreign administrators in a deliberate attempt to open up the society to a wider set of influences. Now, Mongol conquest soon branched out from China. In the eastern part of the Middle East, the Mongols conquered Baghdad and overthrew the last Arab caliphate. A Mongol Khanate was established in the eastern Middle East, which held sway for several decades. Now, Mongol Khanates also fanned out in Central Asia, aiding in the first coherent political organization of that region. The other great conquest of the Mongols involved Russia toward the end of the 13th century. Now, in Russia, rulers were having increasing difficulties with restive nobles. The resulting Mongol sweep across European Russia exempted very few territories, but spared Western Europe. Now, Mongol efforts also pressed into Southeast Asia at key points. And by the late 13th century, the block of territory held by interlocking Mongol Khanates was without precedent in world history. Now, the results of these invasions were significant, with some durable elements. Overland travel from west to east became increasingly easy. Popes began to send Christian emissaries to the Mongols quite early, both to persuade the invaders to stay out of Western Europe and Catholic territory, and to convert some peoples in the Mongol realms. Now, Western merchants took advantage of the safe passage granted by the Khans into Mongol territory. And we also know of some trips by European Jews, artists, and entertainers. Now, this openness amplified exchanges of knowledge that would gradually begin to close the traditional technology gap between East Asia and Western Europe. Accelerated contact in this period also had a downside. It was in the Mongol period that the Black Death began in China and spread quickly to the Middle East and to Europe. 1/4 to 1/3 of the population of Western Europe and the Middle East succumbed to plague. and the advantages of access to new technology may have outweighed the drawbacks of this new level of mortality in Western Europe. Now, Mongol rule began to decline in the latter part of the 14th century. The Mongols were unsuccessful in two efforts at invading Japan by sea, suggesting some limits to their capacity for expansion. The Chinese began to organize more effectively against Mongol rule, ousted the Mongols in the latter part of the 14th century, and quickly established the Ming dynasty. Mongol rule in Russia ended later. Early in the 15th century, local Russian rulers increasingly asserted their independence. By 1450, an autonomous Russian area was established in Moscow, which then became the center of Russia. The expulsion of the Mongols from China and Russia led to reactions that indicated the distaste that these peoples felt for Mongol control. The Chinese would become preoccupied with creating systems to prevent the return of invaders like the Mongols, including the reconstruction of the Great Wall of China. The Russian reaction was to undertake a steady series of conquests, initially designed to push the Mongols farther back, but ultimately becoming a durable Russian commitment to expansionism. Now, the end of the Mongol period for world history meant a return to increasing political barriers. The opportunities for overland travel between Europe and China receded for a considerable period of time. Now, the Mongol period should be viewed as something of a rebalancing among major societies in Europe and Asia. The impact on China includes the Chinese hostility towards outsiders deepened, and defensive barriers were created to prevent future invasion. The Mongols had also confirmed China's importance in world manufacturing. For Russia, they turned from a regional people to an increasingly aggressive and expansionist people. Now, this would be a major theme of the next period in world history, and continues to some extent even to this day. For Japan, the Japanese, having faced two Mongol invasions and been spared in one case by a typhoon that destroyed the Mongol fleet, began to think of themselves as superior to China. Now, the sense of Japanese isolation would be an interesting factor in world history in the succeeding period. For Western Europe, aside from borderline clashes, they did not experience the cost or anxiety of direct Mongol invasion. Instead, it received the benefit of unusually free contact with Asia. The Europeans saw the advantages that new kinds of weaponry could bring to a highly militaristic society, and they also would make use of printing in ways that would have deep implications for their culture and bureaucracy. The Europeans, in other words, were the leading beneficiaries from the Mongol era. For sub-Saharan Africa, it experienced no particular impact from the Mongol conquests, but at the same time, it had no stimulus to learn from new technological opportunities. Now, this was a null case, in other words, that would contrast increasingly with the experience of Western Europe. Now, the decline of the Mongol system could have overwhelmed the patterns of intensifying interregional contacts that we have so vigorously emphasized for the post-classical period. But the system was so successful in its larger sense that it readily survived the Mongols. The question at the end of the 14th century was not whether world contacts would recede, but rather what system, with what routes, and under whose sponsorship would replace the Mongol system. The Mongol era briefly replaced and extended the system created earlier by the Arabs, but it was not the last gasp of global interconnections, and that chapter was about to reopen in new ways in the 15th century.